Yes. So first of all, hi Craig. Thanks. I really, really appreciate your support. We've communicated before. Um, it's not a secret. I'm a rock and pop guy. I've always been a rock and pop guy. I grew up. My mother was pretty uh, young when I was born. So when I was born in 1970. So I really grew up with the rock and pop of the early, late 60s, early 70s. And I will say for me, for everybody, I mean, it's kind of like this, what was the soundtrack of, your life at these particular periods. And, it changed. I mean, in the early 80s, I think I've said this, I had about 3 years that was all Billy Squier and AC/DC. I went there into, Van Halen, from Van Halen into, metal. And then in the 90s, I was really, really heavily invested in 90s alt rock and grunge. So, and I think you see those genres pretty well, represented in my label's releases. They cannot be defined, but it's treason. To answer the part of the question that asks about whether or not the people that I work with at the labels appreciate what we do and how we do it, I'm really happy to say yes. There's a variety of people that I interface with. So, they're the people who act as my sales reps. There are, the people that I work with once production starts and things like that. And then I also get feedback from some of the company at large. It's always a really good sign when one of my reps tags me and says, hey, this executive sitting up in this big office saw your reissues and went crazy for him, and wants to know if you can connect with them and set them up with a couple of copies. I'm very happy to say I've gotten some amazing and wonderful feedback, and the best feedback that I get is that the doors open a little bit wider. I mean, when some of the their cherished catalog titles get treated really well, there are people within the labels that get those, hold them in their hands, and say, "Wow, this is like really other level." And the next time this label makes an ask, like let's do what we can to take care of them. So I'm really happy to say that yes, it is definitely the case that we are appreciated and supported within the halls of the labels we work with. Okay, so the 90s have been a focus from the get-go because one of the two, the two sort of, we have these little sort of series mapped out within the label. One is the Rediscover series, and the other is the Lost 90s series. And both of those, the first 7 or 8 titles that I did, those are the 2 tracks, and there was representation on both sides. In fact, of my first 7 titles, 3 of them were Joe Jackson titles from between 1979 to 82, and the 2 Everclears. So it's always been an idea. In the Lost 90s, the tagline and the explanation for what the Lost 90s series is speaks specifically to the dark era of digital music when, if there were vinyl releases, Europe adopted the CD much more slowly than the US. So for a long time, there were limited small runs that were done just for Europe. And that's why some of the, Everclear is a good example of vinyl that was not made in big quantity in the 90s, but was put out there. So, yes, it's always been an idea that that era where there were either no vinyl runs made or they were very limited and or very poor, it's absolutely always been a focus of mine to try to connect with those labels and artists and give that stuff the full audiophile treatment whenever possible. So Everclear is a great example of that. Matthew Sweet's stuff is really interesting in the sense that all the 3 studio albums that we're doing, Girlfriend, Ultra Beast, and 100% Fun, they not only got early issues, they were actually manufactured by Classic Records, which was a very well-known reissue label. That's who handled the manufacturing and production for that. My belief and assumption is that they were from analog tape, because that's what the master source is. But again, it's fascinating. This is an opportunity for us again to come up and do something that hasn't been done. Girlfriend, they chopped off the last 3 songs of the original 15-song repertoire from the CD, including lopping off the original title track of the album, which was Nothing Lasts, to fit it onto 2 sides. And even taking only the 12 songs they did, they really had to cram them onto those 2 sides. And when you have a time constraint like that, when you're cutting an album, the only way you can get more musical information onto a side is to drop the levels way lower, which means you're losing dynamics. And sometimes you'd also have to filter the bass out, because bass actually takes up more space. Altered Beast was the same way. They got all the original 15 songs onto 2 sides, but one of those sides was, I think, 27, 28 minutes long. And so, with our reissue, we'll be taking that over 3 sides, and the improvement in the sonics is just it's huge. It's just a completely new product. So, long-winded way of saying we are paying very much attention to the 90s, the 80s. And like I said, really, one of the goals of the entire label has always been to really focus a lot, as much as possible, on the catalog from the late 70s, really up through the 2000s. Okay, so this is one of the things that always comes up, is that everybody wants their favorite albums reissued. There's a lot of moving parts to whether a reissue makes sense. The footprint of the artist. I've said this before, and it's kind of interesting. I also have to have a real affinity for the music, because these reissues takes, under the best of circumstances, it takes months and an immense amount of time. I feel reissue, I understand that it's a commercial business, and I do want to make money, and I consider myself a business person and a serious one. But I also think that there are lots of reissue labels out there, and I think for reissue music, the label that approaches a certain album should absolutely love that album. It should be an essential album to the persons or people who make it. I'm not saying Sparkle Horse is or isn't, but I'm just saying that most of the requests I get are, please, release my favorite album on vinyl. And, it's, like I said, whether or not it's been reissued before, when, by whom, whether it's available, there's so many different factors that go into it. But I appreciate all ideas, and that's why I field them and take requests, so to speak. So I would say, even though I can't do everybody's favorite albums, I am definitely going to put a pin in Sparkle Horse and refamiliarize myself, because I definitely remember them. I remember their songs. I need to go back and take a new listen. Thanks for that one. That is a really good question, and I would say one of the things that people ask about and or are confused about is remastering is not the same thing as remixing. We almost exclusively, well, I would say this, so far in our label, with all the titles that we've done and the ones that we've got in the can that we haven't even released yet, they have all been from the final stereo master, which is a mix down from the original, multi-tracks. There have been cases, so the process of going back and actually to the original multi-tracks and doing a new mix, it's not something that's come up. I did at one point, I was exploring doing a 60s jazz title for which there was a 3-track master. That was a very specialized case, and in that case, we would have done our own stereo mixdown. But in our process, that isn't something that we do. We work from original stereo masters that are compiled and sequenced. And, really what we're doing is, primarily, working on an ultra transparent, all analog chain, and levels, EQ, and some of the other, good housekeeping. There have been some times here and there where we've noticed that there's like an actual channel imbalance. So a vocal kind of pulls to one side or the other, and it seemed to literally be a case where on the master, one channel was obviously louder than the other, and that's something that we can change easily and kind of, move a vocal just a smidge toward the center if it makes sense at all. But even that we only do when it's a very subtle case and we kind of talk about it. But in any case, we don't do any remixing.
Who sits in the street on his miserable throne?
The disappointing no's, there are way too many to recount, and bear in mind that I never asked for the Beatles or U2 or any of the, untouchables. I would say this, I don't want to name names and I don't want to give away other people's secrets. I think the times I've been the most disappointed is when I reach out directly to an artist and get to make my case, which I think is a very strong one, and an artist says no, that to me is always disappointing, without naming names again. But I would say, again, in my canon so far, there are a lot, I mean, I've loved all of these titles. I love all of this music. The artist approved editions that I've done have meant a lot to me. Murray Head himself, I dealt directly with Murray through Phil Brown, who's become a friend, the great recording engineer. They're just wonderful people, and that entire process was amazing. I already had Field Day going when I got in the loop with Marshall Crenshaw, but he loved what we were doing. He wanted to do a different cover, and we were able to do that. That was all great. I will say this though, again, like they're all my children and I don't want to pick a favorite, but I will say, in terms of the footprint that a given album had at a time in my life, when Billy Squier's Don't Say No came down the pipe for me and I got the yes on that, that was a really huge day. I was 11 years old when that came out. I had it on cassette. I didn't have the album yet. And I've literally loved that album. I've played the snot out of it since 1981. And in that period, there were literally 3 years where I don't remember listening to anything other than Billy Squier and AC/DC. So in terms of the album that really just had a huge footprint at a very, I was still obviously very young, being 11 years old when I started listening to Billy Squier. But I was definitely old enough for it to have a tremendous amount of impact that has carried through to this day. I mean, I've never stopped playing that album, and the one that came after it, Emotions Emotion, I'm hugely fond of as well, and hope to reissue on Intervention one day. How deep is I will tell you how deep my love is. And I am happy to say I've been married for 22 years. She's absolutely the love of my life. How Deep Is Your Love is one of the songs that we slow danced to at our wedding when it was just us out on the dance floor. So, very deep.